The Animorphs were gathered around a warm fireplace back at Dancer's house. He'd invited them to stay at his home tonight. It still resembled a barn in many ways, and all of the furniture was scaled for a reindeer. Still, it was much cozier than the stable they'd crashed in the night before. Dancer came back out of the kitchen with another platter full of Christmas cookies. "I'm sorry again that I don't have any food better suited for human children." "Are you kidding?" Marco said. "I would eat cookies for every meal. This is the best, Dancer." He bit the top off of a Christmas tree-shaped cookie and was already reaching for another. Cassie and Rachel were seated together on a long, low cushion as Rachel recounted the labor history of the fire elves, from their scattered forest origins to their advocacy for better working conditions and more equitable advancement opportunities in the field. Marco was seated next to Jake, with Tobias perched next to them on a low side table, talking about Visser 3's monster morph. Jake said, "It was like some kind of wintry monster with 2 heads," Marco said, through a mouthful of cookies. "2 heads and wicked armor under all that soft fur," Jake continued. "His neck and tail were striped," Marco added, "like this," picking up a candy cane from the platter. "Sounds cute," Tobias laughed. He's had the fire elves redo his outfit, and he was now gleaming with long, shiny, golden silk feathers. Whenever he turned, hundreds of red, orange, and yellow beads caught the firelight and sparkled. "You wouldn't think it was so cute if you'd seen what it did to that dude," Jake said, picking up a gingerbread man and breaking it in half to demonstrate. Dancer brought one more platter of candy out from the kitchen and settled in by the Animorphs. They just looked like kids now, sitting around the fireplace, curled up with blankets around them, chatting and laughing, snacking on cookies and candy. Dancer let out an audible sigh. This is what Christmas should be like for kids, he thought. But no, these kids were in his house to form a plan to stop a hostile takeover by brain-controlling extraterrestrial space slugs. He felt awful interrupting their moment of relaxation, but it was time. "Animorphs," he began. "This time last night, I was sound asleep in my bed, ready as usual for the big Christmas job, and unaware of the immediate danger the whole North Pole was in at that very moment." He looked around at all of their faces illuminated in the soft glow of the firelight. "Since you've been here today, I was forced to reckon with the most alarming threat to us all that I've ever known. These days are not merry or bright, and we still have so much ahead of us, but I'm honored to have met all of you, the Animorphs." As he finished his speech, the distinct sound of bells rang from a distance outside, 12 times. "Christmas Eve," Dancer said. "Time for a plan to save Christmas."
It was settled. After a couple more hours planning that night, the Animorphs managed to get a few hours of sleep before the big day. Their plan, though it had risks and unknowns, was in place. As they saw it, 2 major objectives had to be accomplished: save Santa and find and destroy the Cadrona. Jake and Marco would go to the toy factory to initiate freeing Santa, while Cassie and Tobias joined Dancer to rally all the other reindeers as reinforcements to the rescue mission. Meanwhile, Rachel is heading back to UFE Local 809, and along with the fire elves would find and destroy the Cadrona. It was Christmas Eve, and both missions had to be accomplished before midnight, or else Visser 3 and his elf controllers would be off traveling around the entire world using Santa's magical body to guide them. Who knew the amount of new hosts they could infect, channeling all of Santa's powers? Rachel met with the fire elves at the Union Hall first thing in the morning. She would be walking to work at the toy factory with them. They'd been told yesterday that they were only to stoke the fires once in the morning and then work in production the rest of the day. They would stroke the fireplaces, but then they would not be working the rest of the day. The Fire Elf Union was on strike. They planned to remain in the factory, each stationed at their respective fireplace that they prepared picket signs and were ready to march. They still had to figure out where the Cadrona possibly was in order for its rays to reach the pools below. It had to be somewhere on the factory floor. They knew that. But there was still so much they didn't know about it. Would it be big or small? What was it shaped like? And most importantly, what would it take to destroy it? They had all day to figure that out, as Christmas Eve was one continuous 18-hour shift. Rachel would be joining them. Not only did she know the most about the Yeerks, she'd also become sympathetic to the Fire Elves Union cause, and believed it was just. Season's greetings and good morning, Rachel. Grendel greeted her when she walked into the Union Hall. A hot mug of coffee was handed to her. Praline root, Grendel explained, roasted and steeped overnight, then brought to a boil in the morning. Thank you, Rachel said, looking around the hall. She thought the place was full last night, but now every fire elf in the North Pole must have been packed inside. Just like last night, a spread of food was laid on tables. But this morning, it was pastries and sweets of all kinds, all of which looked homemade and very fresh. The energy in the hall was buzzing, scattered throughout the crowd. Rachel could make out picket signs everywhere, with another stack by the door for anyone who didn't have their own. The excitement was palpable. More like a party than a strike, Rachel thought. She turned to Grandiel. So I was thinking about it. I have a couple of morphs that could fit in your pocket. Of course, every 2 hours I'd have to sneak off to the restroom or somewhere private to morph back quickly, but I think that's a minor obstacle. Grandiel looked at her and smiled. We were thinking about that too, Rachel, and I think we have a better idea. Come back here. Oh, grab some breakfast on your way. Rachel ate more cookies and candy that Dancer put out again in the morning, but she wasn't about to pass up this spread. Balancing a fully loaded paper plate along with her praline root coffee, she followed Grandiel to a small office off the main hall. 2 other elves were inside, not fire elves, bent over the desk when Rachel entered. They looked up from their work. Oh my, said one of the elves. You were right, very tall. Rachel immediately started to feel self-conscious again. After just moments ago, feeling more welcome than anywhere, even with the Animorphs sometimes, her cheeks flushed and she stared at the floor. Grandiel saw it. Rachel, these are Lineor and Raylon. They're tailor elves. We called them last night, and they've been working since. I hope it fits. Rachel looked back up, still off-put by her height. One of the elves cut a thread, as the other wound and bobbed on the sewing machine. Setting scissors back on the desk, Raylon picked up a fire elf uniform identical to the one Grandiel was and the rest of the ones were at work. Except this one was huge. Well, huge for an elf anyway, but for a girl. We had the legs a little extra long so we could hem them once you got here, Raylon said to Rachel. She was floored. You what? Rachel said in disbelief. What's for you, Rachel, said Grandiel. You're one of us. The uniform was a jumpsuit. Jet black, except for red flames embroidered on each bicep. A thick belt slipped through loops of the waist, and there were gold buttons at the sleeves, shoulder pads, and legs. Embroidered in white on the chest read, Rachel, UFE Local 809. I don't know what to say. Thank you, Rachel said. Thank you. She took the uniform in both hands, inspecting it, before looking up abruptly. But I'll stand out. No one will believe I'm a fire elf for 1 minute. I'm too tall. Rachel, said Granny Elf, it's true. It's unusual for an elf to be as tall as you. But unusual isn't unheard of. A bell rang in the back of the hall. 10 minutes till first shift. Put this on, and we'll get it hemmed for you. Also, don't worry. We'll keep you surrounded. And you can always crouch down if you need. Remember, we don't let another fire elf out of our sight. Well, Rachel was beaming with pride as she swapped her coat for a fire elf uniform, which was insulated and warmer than her coat as well. Radiel ducked out of the room briefly before returning something behind her back. One more thing, she said to Rachel, holding up a picket sign with the phrase, "Fire elves strike back," screen printed on it. Rachel, fully decked out in her fire elf uniform, took the sign and said to Grandiel, "Let's burn it down."
Cassie walked with Dancer while Tobias flew just behind them. Dancer was leading them into the center of the reindeer ranch, where all the other reindeer were meeting for their final preparations for that night. It was a short walk, and on the way they passed other houses, very similar to Dancer's, clearly the residences of the other reindeer. The street teed at an intersection aligning with a larger building, still only 1 story tall, and constructed out of hewn wood, but more ornate than the houses, with a large green in front of it, and bronze statues of reindeers situated along the wide sidewalk. Above a set of double doors, Cassie could see relief carvings depicting historical reindeer games, and on the lintel was carved Reindeer Council. Dancer paused as she was taking it all in. "Cassandra," Dancer began, "Tobias, before we go inside, you need to be aware. There is a reason I didn't bring you here earlier. Us reindeer have a long and storied history. We are the most elite team in the world. That said, some of us can be slow to accept change when confronted with new ideas and perspectives. So much so that it's immortalized in song. I'm sure you've all heard the ballad of Poor Rudolph." Dancer looked up at the carvings on the building. "We have so little time today, though. We are still preparing for a flight tonight. They will have to be convinced not to just go through the motions today. Without Santa, there's nothing for us either. If these reindeer want any hope for the future, they have to act now." "You mean they might not help us?" Cassie asked, stunned. "I hope that's not the case," Cassandra replied Dancer, heading toward the entrance. "If they didn't let one of their own play their games, how are they ever going to trust a girl and a hawk?" Tobias said, so only Cassie could hear. She ignored his question, not wanting to admit that she was feeling the same unease as Tobias. They passed by the last of the statues, a bronze of a reindeer shooting a basket, and through the wooden doors into the Reindeer Council. Inside, the large open central area was octagonal, rising up to... Oh, this is a fancy word. Clerestory windows set into a peaked... Where did that voice come from? Set into a peaked roof. On each side of the octagon, hallways disappeared off to other offices and meeting rooms. A large, low table filled the center, and as Cassie and Tobias approached, they could see an always changing display of screens and maps, cloud cover, temperatures, wind speeds, as well as dozens of indicators neither of them recognized. At any other time, this intricate display would have been the most impressive thing in the room, but not here. Around the screen were gathered 8 other reindeer, each as large and as refined as Dancer. There was no question who they were. Dasher, Prancer, Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donner, Blitzen, and the most famous reindeer of all, Rudolph. Without looking up from the screen, one of the reindeer said, "Dancer, you're 4 minutes late." The display continued its rapid refreshing of data below. "Blitzen," said Dancer, addressing the reindeer who had spoken. "I have urgent news that cannot wait another moment." None of the reindeer looked away from the screen. "It's more urgent than Christmas." As if all in unison, the reindeer jerked their heads toward Dancer, who met their gaze unmoved. As they considered the statement Dancer just announced, their eyes made their way down to Cassie, and then to a hawk perched on Dancer's back. "Dancer," another reindeer shouted, "what is the meaning of this? You yourself have defended the council building against the intrusion by any non-reindeer. Now you bring a fowl and a child, a human child, on Christmas Eve of all days? Protocol allows for us to begin expulsion no later than 3 minutes, beginning now." "Comet is correct and has initiated extraction countdown," a different reindeer continued. "Dancer, you may escort the intruders to the exit within the remaining time clock or prepare for forced removal. If you aid or abet the intruders beyond this time, the council will move to expel you too." "Totally unprecedented, Vixen," the next reindeer took over. "While the articles prescribe an immediate expulsion, it is never intended to be authorized on Christmas Eve itself. There is no precedent for this action and will have to be thoroughly litigated in the council." The rest of the reindeer were now talking among themselves, sounding increasingly agitated. Dancer held his ground and made no apparent move to contest the accusations. Tobias and Cassie turned their eyes from one reindeer to the next, always keeping an eye on the countdown clock, and had taken over the entire display screen. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Cassie could feel the tension rise in the room like a physical object. She looked at Dancer, still no movement to interject, to argue, to defend. She was so mad. "Everybody just shut up," she heard herself shout. She bent over, her arms and legs already extending, fur spreading all over her body, antlers poking out from the top of her head. "Just shut up for 1 minute and shut the clock down." As if responding to the sound of her voice, the countdown clock stopped, then disappeared from the display entirely. The reindeer weren't looking at the screen at all now, though. They were staring at what stood looking back at them. A second Dancer, physically identical to the first, right where a girl had just been. Cassie exhaled a long breath. "That's better," she said. Her girl brain was exhausted from days of doing emotional labor for her friends. Her reindeer brain felt strong, unafraid to say forcefully what she knew was right. She remembered then. Not just any reindeer either, as she floated up to the display screen, and equal with the rest. "We don't have time for this. It's Christmas Eve," a reindeer shouted. Cassie turned toward them immediately. "If you don't listen to me, there won't be another Christmas Eve for you anyway," she replied. "Somebody get the bird," another reindeer shouted, less confidently now. "The hawk stays with me," Cassie said, and she could see the reindeer trying not to meet her eyes now. "Okay, good. Now, season's greetings, everyone." She waited. She would wait all day for this if she had to, never mind the immediacy of the task at hand. No one, not even these, Santa's elite reindeer, were too good for common decency. Finally, one reindeer replied, quietly, still not making eye contact, embarrassed. "Season's greetings to you." Others slowly echoed the greeting until Cassie was satisfied. "Season's greetings. I'm Cassie, and the red-tailed hawk is Tobias. I wish we came to you in better circumstances, but we don't have that luxury." She began telling them about everything they'd seen since arriving in the North Pole, about Yerkes and Santa and Visser III, and meeting Dancer, and how the Animorphs got their power to begin with. And as she was narrating the story, she could see the faces of the reindeer shift, both more receptive and more concerned as she went on. Below her, on the screen, something else was shifting. She was sure of it now. The display screen was actively responding to her voice. As she described their hometown, a perfect 3D version of it appeared, and she could see it all: the beach, the mall, the construction site where the Andalite prince first appeared. As she described their time in the North Pole, a wintry wonderland contoured to the surface. And as she described the separate missions her friends were on today, she could see blinking lights indicated each of their positions. Rachel had already arrived at the toy factory. Jake and Marco sat just outside a window, ready to venture back underground. She was there at the reindeer council with Tobias, who was not there. Cassie spun around in the air to face Dancer. No Tobias there. She looked back at the display screen for his indicator light. There, moving to the north from the council building in a distinct circling flight. Where's Tobias going, Dancer? She shouted. He said he needed to go outside to stretch his wings, Cassandra, replied Dancer. No, 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 Cassie said. Look at this map. He's not just stretching his wings. Dancer and Cassie watched as the light headed further north, opposite the direction of the toy factory. No, this isn't how it goes. Blitzen replied, Cassandra, we still must prepare as if there is a flight tonight. However, we will try to arrive a little early to check on Santa. That's it? Cassie felt defeated. You check on Santa? This is more than a checkup. This is life or death. I know you reindeer don't like change or whatever, but this is everything. Please. And my friend, where's he going? She couldn't believe what was happening. Dancer came alongside her. There's nothing much out there where Tobias is flying, Cassandra. As for the reindeer, I'm afraid I'm bound to uphold the consensus of the council. I will stay here for our final flight preparations, and I will do everything I can to get to the factory early. You too? Cassie shouted. After everything you've seen? She looked around at the reindeer council gathered around the display. I really thought you were supposed to be something special. She morphed out of the reindeer form, returning to her human body, which felt especially small next to these gigantic magical creatures. I guess I was wrong.
The fire elves arrived for the first shift at the toy factory. And even though it was Christmas Eve, they still were the first ones on the floor. They divided into their respective crews to stoke each fireplace spread throughout the factory. Today, they loaded every piece of stacked firewood they had. It wouldn't be the most efficient burn, but these fires would stay lit well into the workday. Rachel cut close to Grandy Elf's team, assisting when she could, like carrying double the logs of any other fire elf. Then, the picket signs came out, and the strike began. As other elves arrived for work, they were greeted to a group of fire elves, picket signs raised in the air, marching in groups around each fireplace. If anyone noticed a tall, thin fire elf with a particularly clean uniform that morning, they were too preoccupied with the whole scene to question it. For the first few hours, the strike had gone by mostly uneventful, with nothing more than a few angry looks directed towards the fire elves. It wasn't until after lunchtime, when the fires in the fireplace began cooling off, and the other elves started making disparaging comments towards the fire elves. But they were united, and the picket line held. Since walking out together the day before, and since weeks of protecting each other, the fire elves shared a purpose, and were ready for whatever would come their way. And what the other factory elves didn't know was that in addition to their strike, the fire elves were engaged in a second cause. Each marched around the fireplace. Each time a black work boot stepped in front of the other, the fire elves were searching, eyes wide open. So many details about the object of their search were still unknown. But one thing was certain. The Kandrona, the life-giving source for the Yerks that they couldn't live without, was somewhere in this very building. Destroy it, and none of the Yerks could survive in the North Pole. They striked and they searched. By afternoon, though, there was still no sign of the Kandrona, and worse, all the fires were completely out, leaving a chill in the whole factory. Elves were putting on hats and gloves, but they continued working, growing visibly agitated at the striking fire elves. Rachel heard raised voices at one of the far fireplaces, and could see a group of bake elves with their arms in the air gesturing and shouting at fire elves. The fire elves didn't engage, just continued their line. But it wasn't long before a similar outbreak occurred, much closer to Rachel this time. A group of tinker elves approached and was trying to separate off a single fire elf. Rachel couldn't help but notice the tool belts around their waists and considered how quickly a screwdriver or clamp could become a weapon. "We're freezing, useless fire elf!" a tinker elf shouted. The group of fire elves pulled in closer together. Some linked arms, and the shouting continued. and this group of fire elves was now bunched together in front of the fireplace. They conferred together, and one responded, "We stoked the fires once this morning as instructed by the shop supervisor. Any complaints as to the nature of our work can be addressed by Lenore. Otherwise, we would welcome your solidarity." The Tinker Elves stopped screaming, no less agitated, but remained menacingly close. Are they controller elves? Rachel thought. With Yerks in their heads? They must be. Why else would the elves turn on elves? Behind her, more shouting. This time from elves Rachel didn't recognize. "Damn," Gradiel said behind her. "HVAC elves. We've lost them. We've lost the factory. I don't like where this is heading." "What do we do?" Rachel asked, her picket sign resting on her shoulder. "We look out for each other. We regroup. Come back together. We need to stand as a unified front on this. We're too spread out all over this, as it is," Gradiel said. "I want to move our team over to join the closest others. We'll keep adding from there until we're all the way back together, and we'll stand united." Rachel and her band of 12 elves moved together when Gradiel gave the sign, joining another contingent with 18 fire elves. "Spread the word," Gradiel said. "We're moving." All around the factory, small groups of elves became larger groups, consolidating their forces until there were 2 groups of either end. By this point, the fire elves' movements were attracting the attention of the rest of the elves on the factory floor. "Steady," Gradiel said, as the fire elves began linking arms together. "Steady!" As quickly as it happened the previous day, an object was hurled at the group. No one moved. Then something else came hurtling towards Grandiel's group. A star-shaped ornament was shattered on the floor. Then a deluge of items, toy parts, tools, even mugs and eggnog, with the eggnog still in it. It was happening on both ends of the factory. The fire elves taking cover under the protest side, looking around at the other elves. Elves they'd known for millennia, turning on them. The true group of fire elves could see the other, opposite them, and in the middle, the huge decorated Christmas tree, moving as if a single organism. The groups of fire elves headed for the tree, slowly bearing the abuse until the masses joined together in a single whole. They gathered around that tree. The mass of other elves swarming them was even larger. However, as they shouted and volley of objects were thrown unrelenting, their peaceful strike was being overwhelmed by elves. Almost certainly all the elves with Yerk's controllers, their every movement. Rachel was standing in the inmost throng of the fire elf front, packed side by side with her Union allies, looking them over, trying to escape being struck by any number of hazardous objects in the air, turning her gaze now to follow the fire elves nearest to her. Up. They were looking up at that Christmas tree. From this close, it was unquestionably the largest Christmas tree Rachel had ever seen. Larger than most buildings back home. She watched as the first few fire elves disappeared into the interior, then saw hands and heads reappearing up and up the branches. She understood. They were boxed in. There was only one option now, and that was to go up. Even as she followed, her left hand on a pine branch, now her feet, and she was climbing higher and higher. She couldn't stop thinking about what they were giving up. They'd been here all day. And what did they have to show for it? The strike was shut down, mauled by violent elves, and they were no closer to finding the Cadrona. Then they'd started. Here she was, climbing a branch high above the factory floor, in a tree surrounded by every other fire elf in the North Pole. With nothing, she spotted Grandiel ascending a branch nearby. "Grandiel," Rachel said, "we failed."
Two turtle doves perched in a recessed alcove above the entrance of Visser Claus's private chamber in an unfinished tunnel that appeared to have been abandoned. Jake and Marco had been there all day and still no sign of Santa. And in this space they could morph every 2 hours as needed and stay in their inconspicuous turtle dove morph all day. Still nothing, said Marco. For Christmas Eve, I expected a little more action. He looked at Jake, who had been quiet all day. Marco knew why. Tom was still down there, only now out of the cage, with a yerk in his head. They'd caught a glimpse of him earlier in the day disappearing up a sloping ramp at the far end of a cavern with other controllers from the sharing. They'd actually been laughing and high-fiving. It made Jake and Marco sick. Down below, there were a few elves in the cages, meaning most of the yerks were in their heads right now. The most activity was concentrated down at the far end. I think we should get close to the ramp, Marco said. I've been looking, and there's other alcoves like this one every 50 feet or so. Something's happening down there, and it might tell us more about what Mr. 3 is planning. Okay, if you think so, Jake replied. He'd been deferring to Marco all day. It's just a hunch, Jake. Maybe we overhear something that'll help us? Maybe we get a glimpse of the ramp up there, Marco replied. But I need you with me on this, Jake. I need your help. I don't know what I'm doing either, and I don't want to mess up. I know you want to help your brother, Jake. We all have people we care for. I get it. Jake looked up at his friend. Marco was right. And Jake hadn't been making it easier for him all day. He had to do this for Tom, and Marco did it for his dad. And all the Animorphs had people they all cared about. Now was the time. Okay, Marco, which alcove are we shooting for? It was a relief for Marco to hear his friend back. If they made it through this, they would ski every hour for the rest of the day until school started in January. And then he'd study every hour of he didn't want to get ahead of himself. I think we just work our way down, a little at a time. We could be quick and stop at a point if it seems dangerous to go further, Marco said. Perfect, said Jake. You lead the way. Marco was ready for this. He'd been spying all day with few results. With the flap of his wings, it was a single swoop to the next alcove. As quickly as he took off, Jake was behind him, and they landed on the edge of another partially carved alcove. Feeling good to use these wings after sitting all day, Marco said. Jake laughed a little, which came out sounding like a coo from a turtle dove morph. All right, one more? Asked Marco. Jake nodded, and just like before, they were off, soaring and landing to the next perch. Those yerks sure are stupid, said Marco. If there were birds flying through my house, I think I'd notice. Let's go to the next opening. I think we can overhear some more from the next ramp. He opened his wings and soared into the next alcove, making a display of his landing. That was the easiest one yet, Jake, he said. Jake? Marco looked both ways, and then back to where he had just flown from. Jake hadn't followed this time. He was still perched on the edge, intently staring down at Marco, followed his gaze to the base of the ramp, where it met the cavern floor. A number of elves had just emerged wearing face shields and carrying toolboxes. Behind the elves, humans, and among humans, Tom. It happened before Marco could even shout to try and stop it. Jake had flown off the ledge, descending directly toward Tom. Marco watched as Jake landed on the stone floor. He watched as the humans, the sharing, stopped in their tracks and pointed at the turtle dove. He watched as three of them cornered the bird. He watched as the turtle dove start this way and that, start for an opening, only to have it closed. He watched as the human controller put both his hands around the turtle dove and held it up for inspection. He watched as a Hork-Bajir arrived seemingly out of nowhere, small wire cage in hand. He watched as the turtle dove was shoved, wings beating, head frantically turning into the cage up against the wires. Then he swooped down and was grabbed by the sharing too.